Hi everyone, and welcome to the Knit California podcast. My name is Leslie. I am Knit California here on YouTube and also over on Instagram, and I'm bringing you a very special video today. It is my drop shoulder sweater comparison video. This video is about 3.5 months in the making, and I'm so excited that it's finally here. A little bit nervous. If you see me looking over here, it's because I have my laptop with my PowerPoint notes on it so that I don't forget anything, and I have all of the information organized to give it to you in a cohesive manner. But we're gonna get right into it. Kind of a little bit of like an outline of how this video is gonna go. I'm gonna talk to you about like where this whole idea started, how this kind of all came to be. We're gonna get into the sweaters that I made. I'm gonna talk to you a little bit about the comparison of all three of the patterns, how the sweaters actually ended up after knitting them. We're gonna answer the question, the main question, which one is my favorite and which one would I knit again? And then I had a couple other questions that came up on Instagram and on YouTube that people wanted me to answer. And so I've got that in there at the end. And then at the very end, we'll talk through some additional classic drop shoulder sweater patterns that you may be interested in and that I am interested in knitting after this. So let's dive into it. So how did this all begin? Well, back in like September, I was in a bit of a mood and I was just upset that I kept buying yarn and I wasn't using the yarn that had been in my stash for a year, for a few months, that I was buying at the beginning of the year, and now it was getting closer to the end of the year. And I just told myself I'm going to kind of chill a little bit on buying yarn. That hasn't fully kept up, but that was the idea. And I'm going to make some sweaters from the yarn. It was in this cubby right here, from the yarn in my stash. And I think you can see, if you go back and watch my fall and winter knitting plans video, as I'm talking through each of the yarns, each of the sweaters that I had chosen, I realized, okay, I have 3 drop shoulder designs and 3 raglan designs. And I was like, wouldn't it be cool, because all of these finished object sweaters kind of have the same feel to them. They're all very classic drop shoulder designs or classic raglan designs in that they're pretty much just basic stockinette. They don't have any like fancy details, there's no cabling, slight variations when it comes to like ribbing or construction or techniques, those sorts of things, but the like basics of these designs were very similar. And so the idea came to me, why don't we compare the designs? I wanted to know for myself which sweater patterns I enjoyed making the most, which sweater patterns I thought would be great for beginners. I wanted to really understand like yarn choice in relation to pattern choice. And another big piece from all of this was I wanted to better understand how I like my sweaters to fit and how I like to wear my sweaters in terms of like positive ease and drape and fit and all of those things. And even after knitting like the first 2 sweaters, I felt like I had a much better understanding of this. And I'm now working on sweater number 4, soon to be going on to sweater number 5, and I feel like we're golden. I have been achieving that goal. So after all of that, I decided to start with 3 of the drop shoulder designs so that I could knit them all and then come back and make this video to compare all of the drop shoulder designs. And that's what I did all of fall. Now we're in winter and I'm knitting through the 3 raglan designs, and in March, April timeframe, I'll have another video like this comparing all 3 raglan designs. So if you enjoy this video, please come back in a few months to see the raglan design video. So that's kind of where this all started. So like I said, I chose to knit 3 drop shoulder sweater designs first. Now, the question came up, what is the difference between a drop shoulder sweater design versus other sweater types, sweater designs? And so I wanted to run through this pretty quickly before we really get into it, just so that everyone kind of understands we're all on the same page here. So there are about, I don't want to like say this is like the end all be all, but there are about 4 like main types of sweater construction method. Number 1, I would say, is a circular yoke design. This is pretty self-explanatory, but the yoke is knit in a circle. So as you're knitting it, it's like knit in a circle with regularly spaced increases so that that circle stays circular. Some example patterns that use a circular yoke design, the ranunculus, the love note, if you've seen those, or stripes by Andrea Mowry. Those are all circular yoke designs. The second type of sweater construction is a raglan sweater. In a raglan sweater, you have regular increases that actually make lines on the front and on the back of your sweater. This creates more of like a square yoke shape compared to like the circular yoke is a circle. The raglan is a little bit more of a square, and the increases, you can see them very clearly in these lines on the front and back of your sweater. Some examples of raglan designs are the Cozy Classic Raglan by Jessie Maid or the No Frills Sweater by Petite Knit. The third type of sweater construction is a set-in sleeve sweater. This type of sweater has like, I would say is more boxy, where the front whole like panel is like a rectangle, the back whole panel is a rectangle, and your sleeves are set in right at the shoulder. I would actually say a set-in sweater is very, very similar to a drop shoulder sweater, which is what this is that I'm wearing right now. Where the drop shoulder sweater, you are also getting this rectangular shape in the front and in the back, but the sleeves for a drop shoulder compared to a set-in sleeve is much lower. So the drop shoulder, the sleeve is hitting you maybe like halfway down on your bicep, whereas the set-in sleeve would come up right at your shoulder. And then other characteristics of a drop shoulder is that typically, and I'm saying typically, not always, typically a drop shoulder is a bit more boxy and oversized in general because that sleeve is set further down on the arm. This sweater shape is appealing to me because I really like the oversized rectangular shaping. A lot of drop shoulders are designed to be slightly cropped, so you get that like wide look but a shorter length, so it's not just like super wide and super long. There's a little bit of balance there. And some examples of drop shoulders are these 3 designs that I picked to knit myself. So the first, and I have all 3 of these sweaters here, but I will be sharing, I will be putting up photos of all of these designs as I talk about them so that you can see what they look like, which sweater it actually is. But so the first sweater that I knit was the Oslo Sweater, and I like can't even get it back far enough for you to see. But this is the Oslo Sweater by Petite Knit, and the yarn that I used for this is Sorella yarn, her Stellina fingering base held with her mohair base in the colorway Folklore. This was from the Taylor Swift collection. The second sweater that I knit is the one that I'm wearing. This is the Clove sweater by Rachel Kurihara, and I knit this in Explorer Knits and Fibers Rocky's DK in the colorway Barrel Aged Sour. And the third design that I knit, this one is the Dear Duomo sweater by Seunghee Hong, and this was knit in Explorer Knits and Fibers 2 strands of Cashmere Caverns sock, so that's 2 strands of fingering weight held together, and this is in the colorway Fia from her Ireland collection. We're gonna now get into how the patterns differ. When I first had the idea to knit all 6 of these patterns in a row, I pulled up a handy dandy spreadsheet and I started writing down kind of the main information for each of the patterns. So I wanted to see the differences in the sizes offered, which size I would pick to knit, the recommended gauge, the recommended needle size, the kind of recommended amounts of positive ease. I thought all of this would be interesting to see all compared together, and I thought especially for ease, amount of positive ease, and the width and length of the pattern, I thought it would be really important for me to have that information because it would help me better understand how I like to wear my sweaters. So that's kind of where all of this started. I also wanted to see if it was possible to potentially knit 2 of these at a time, or if they were all gonna use the same needle size and stuff like that. So alright, let's get into it. Starting with the sizes offered, the Oslo Sweater by Petite Knit offers sizes extra small through 3XL. This is 41¼ to 59 inches in the bust, 105 to 150 centimeters, and that includes 8 to 10 inches or 20 to 25 centimeters of positive ease. The Clove sweater is offered from XX small to 5XL. This is 34 to 70 inches in the bust, or 86.3 to 177.8 centimeters. And this includes 6 to 10 inches of positive ease, 15 to 25 centimeters. And lastly, the Dear Duomo offers sizes 1 through 9. So that's 28 to 62 inches, or 71 to 158 centimeters, and this includes 6 to 8 inches of positive ease, or 15 to 20 centimeters. So kind of what was interesting to me to see was that the Dear Duomo is recommended a lot smaller amount of positive ease at 6 to 8 inches, whereas the other two, the Oslo and the Clove, 6 to 10 or 8 to 10 inches of positive ease. My initial reaction was to go straight for that 10 inches of positive ease as much as possible. But I also thought to myself, I will knit the Dear Duomo at kind of the recommended amount of ease because I want to see how I actually like that when it's knit up. I might surprise myself and actually enjoy closer to 6 inches of positive ease. I might surprise myself there. So that was that. I think a really important question and kind of saga in the Knitstagram community, especially right now, is just making sure we're knitting patterns that are size inclusive and trying to not support as much designers who are not being size inclusive in all of their patterns. I know Petite Knit has come up a lot in this conversation. From what I understand, her more recent patterns, as she keeps releasing them, are more and more size inclusive. The Oslo Sweater here, let's see, extra small, small, medium, large, is offered in 7 sizes, up to a 59-inch bust, which is not quite, I think, where we want to be as a community. I think we want to see upwards of 60 inches being included in the bust. It's very, very close, but I just want to point that out in case you're thinking of knitting petite knit patterns. That is the sizes offered. Okay, looking at recommended gauge. When I first started looking at recommended gauge, I was really only interested in stitch gauge and not as much row gauge, because I felt like with row gauge, like if I'm not meeting row gauge, I can just like knit longer until I get to the recommended, you know, like inches size measurement. Turns out row gauge is pretty important. It's one thing that I learned while knitting, especially this one, the Clove sweater, but that's okay. Okay, anyway, so the Oslo sweater recommended gauge is 21 stitches by 30 rows. The Clove sweater is recommended 22 stitches by 34 rows. And the Dear Duomo is recommended 20 stitches by 28 rows. And this relates to the recommended needle size for all of these patterns. The Oslo recommends 4.5mm needle, the Clove recommends a 4mm needle, and the Dear Duomo recommends the 4.5mm needle. You can see, you know, the Clove sweater has the smallest gauge at 22 stitches per 4 inches, and they're recommending the smaller needle size, so that kind of matches up. Now into more of the construction and the recommended yarn and the clarity of the patterns. So the Oslo sweater is knit top down, and the back shoulder, I think I need to like preface this. So in terms of construction, in general, when you're knitting a drop shoulder sweater, you're not just, if you're knitting it top down, you're not just starting to knit in the round. If you're knitting it top down, typically you knit the back, kind of like rectangle or trapezoid, whatever shape it is. You knit the back piece first. You'll need to pick up stitches to knit over the shoulder on both sides. Then you'll connect the front in the round right underneath where the neck is, and you're still knitting flat the front panel until you get to the point where you can connect the back panel and the front panel under the arms, and then you're knitting in the round down to the end of the body, and then you will pick up stitches here to knit the sleeves. If you are knitting the sweater bottom up, it's pretty much the opposite. You will start to knit in the round at the bottom. You'll knit all the way up to the sleeves, and then you will separate for the front and back panel. There are different construction methods for knitting the front, knitting the back, connecting here at the shoulder, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in 1 second. So, the Oslo sweater is knit top down, and I also discovered when knitting top down, there are different construction methods for knitting the back panel. For some reason, I thought there was only like kind of one way that you would knit it, with like kind of regular, what I would think, or what I did think a couple months ago, were like regular increases to make the back panel. That's how the Oslo sweater is knit. So the Oslo sweater construction is top down, and to make the back panel, you use knit front and back increases to knit that, which I really enjoyed that construction method. That was one of my favorites. The Clove sweater is knit top down, but you use short row shaping to do the increases on the back panel. That was like a little mind-boggling to me at first. I was like, short row shaping here? We're not like, you know, I just thought it was like so different, and it like really threw me off. But I've come to learn that that's also like normal and regular and fine. But that was pretty funny. And then the Dear Duomo sweater is knit bottom up, with two options for the shoulder and neckline increases. You can either do short row shaping or what she calls a sloped bind off method shaping. So in terms of construction, I guess the question you would ask then, well, which one is the best? And the best is always subjective. I might say what I think is the best and it'll be different than what you say is the best. But for me, I really enjoyed knitting the Oslo sweater in terms of construction. I liked that it was top down. I liked the knit front and back increases. The short rows, like I said, in the Clove sweater like really threw me off. And the Dear Duomo knitting it bottom up was worrisome for me at first, I'm not gonna lie. But from everyone else who had made the Dear Duomo, I had only heard really good things about it. And so that kind of helped my confidence with it a little bit, and helped me to not worry about it as much as I started knitting it. So the one thing that I was really worried about with the bottom up construction method was making sure that the length of the body was going to be the right length for me. And since I knit that 1/3, what I actually did was I measured this sweater, the Clove sweater, I think I measured it from here. What I did was I took a measurement from the bottom of the neckline to the bottom of the sweater, and then I also took measurements from the top of the shoulder to the bottom of the armhole, so I had that like armhole distance, and then the bottom of the armhole to the bottom of the sweater, so I had the like body length distance, and I used those measurements to figure out the length of the Dear Duomo from the bottom up design. The Dear Duomo had like a great schematic, and it had the measurements in there of like what this should be, and so once you have this measurement, you can figure out how long you want the length to be, and it worked out really nicely. So I wasn't worried after the fact, after I did that, because I knew that it would be the length that I wanted it to be. So that's a little hot tip in there for your bottom up sweaters. Okay, so that's the construction. Now we also need to look at the recommended yarn for each of these patterns because they're all three very different. So the Oslo Sweater recommends a fingering weight yarn held with a mohair. The Clove Sweater recommends a 1 strand of DK yarn. And the Dear Duomo recommends 2 strands of fingering weight held together. That is what the sample was knit in, but it also says in the pattern that you could use a 1 strand of fingering held with 1 strand of mohair, or just 1 straight strand of DK. So it gives you options, and I think as long as you are getting close or meeting gauge, you can kind of knit with whatever you want, which is nice. One of the questions that kept coming up also was the clarity of each of the patterns, and to be honest, all 3 patterns were clear and easy to follow. I had no issues reading any of the patterns. I originally had some issues when knitting the Clove sweater, kind of like I mentioned before, just because I was caught off guard with the techniques used, but now I realize that like those are totally normal drop shoulder shaping techniques, and I just needed to get used to it, so that was like a me problem and not a pattern problem. Alright, now we're gonna get into the pattern measurements versus the finished object. This is something that I have been struggling with as a knitter like pretty much since I started knitting, and it all comes down to the fact that I pretty much never am on gauge. So coming into this like project of knitting 3 drop shoulders and 3 raglan designs, I really wanted to focus on like being on gauge, using the right needle size to get the right measurements for the pattern. And the frustrating thing, and this is something that everyone goes through as a knitter, and just the frustrating thing is that like you knit a gauge swatch, no matter how small or how big it is, and you block it, and the measurements before blocking are different than the measurements after blocking. And it's the same thing for your sweater, right? You knit the whole sweater and it has the measurements that it has, and then you block it and it has different measurements, which like is good because the sweater always fits better after blocking, but it's just so hard to know if what you're knitting is gonna turn out to be the measurements that you want it to be. And it's just something that I've been struggling with. And I'm like, why can't it just be the right measurements the first time? We do love blocking here on this channel though. If you don't know, we are blocking stands. So, but that's kind of where this all stemmed from. So, I will say at one time, my bust measurement is 40 inches, so that is how I am choosing a size for each of these patterns and choosing an amount of positive ease. So the size that I ended up knitting for each pattern. Let's start with the Oslo Sweater. I chose to knit the size extra large, which is a 51-inch bust. The yarn estimates for this sweater, it tells you need 1,664 yards of fingering plus 1,624 yards of mohair for this size. That's 4 skeins of fingering of the Sorella yarn that I used and 4 skeins of mohair. That's 8 skeins total that I had to buy for this sweater. And you can do the math on how much that cost using hand-dyed yarn. What I ended up with left over was 84 grams of fingering and 46 grams of mohair. That's less than 1 skein each left over. So I did need all 8 of those skeins. The gauge. So the gauge recommended for this pattern is 21 stitches. I ended up with a 21.5 stitch gauge, which is slightly smaller. It means I had more stitches per 4 inches by half a stitch. And the recommended needle size for this pattern was 4.5 millimeter needles, and that's what I actually ended up using to knit this, so I was like really excited. Usually I have to go up a needle size, but I used the recommended needle size for this pattern, so 4.5 millimeters on the body, 3.5 millimeters on the ribbing. Positive ease. So based on the size of the extra large in the pattern was supposed to be 51 inches in circumference. That's 11 inches of positive ease for me. I ended up, my final blocked sweater ended up with 10 inches of positive ease. So I was actually very happy with how close I was there. And in general, I am very happy with that amount of positive ease on my body. I like the way this sweater fits, and it makes me feel good. And then finally, the intended length of the sweater, so like from here to the bottom, versus the final length. The sweater tells you for this size, and this is measured on the back of the sweater, so from the back of the neckline to the bottom is supposed to be 24.5 inches. I ended up with 20.5 inches. Now, if you want to go see a saga, go watch all of my videos on the Oslo Sweater, because basically the short version of this was I knit it the length to pattern, tried it on, and was like, this is way too long. And I cut the pattern. I literally just cut, I don't want to show you, but like from here down, like cut it off. I unraveled, actually I did 2 cuts, and I took out like 4 inches of body knitting in the middle of the sweater, and then I Kitchener stitched the bottom ribbing back to the top of the sweater. It was a learning experience. but it got the sweater length to where I wanted it to be, which was the most important part. So that's the Oslo sweater. All right, let's move to the Clove sweater. I chose to knit the size large, which is a 50-inch bust. The yarn estimates, it said 1,380 yards of DK, which is 5 skeins of DK yarn from Explorer Knits. I ended up with 33 grams of DK left over. That's 1/3 of a skein. I was really worried that I was gonna end up playing yarn chicken with this yarn. I actually like knit a swatch and then ripped it out and used that yarn. So if I like had kept that swatch and I just might have been playing more yarn chicken there. It was kind of worrying, but we did it. We were fine. The recommended gauge for this pattern was 22 stitches. My gauge ended up being 24 stitches. So again, smaller than recommended because I had more stitches per 4 inches. Another way to think about this is the recommended gauge is 22 stitches per 4 inches. I had 22 stitches in like 3.8 inches instead of 4 inches. So that my row gauge also was off. It definitely impacted the sizing of this sweater. One of the big worries for me when knitting this was I felt like the length from here, right here is the shoulder seam, to the bottom of the neck, I felt like this distance was not big enough, and I was so worried that the neckline was going to be way too small and was not going to fit over my head, and it was going to be really tight. It actually ended up being fine, and kind of my conclusion was because my row gauge was off, I do think this should have ended up longer, but I was like really worried I was like missing something in the pattern. Like I thought maybe the instructions should have been to like do an increase row and then do a regular row and then an increase row and then a regular row instead of like increase rows every row. But I was not missing anything in the pattern. It was just that my row gauge was off. And what this also led to with my stitch gauge being off was I thought that the arm circumference was not going to be wide enough in the bicep, and I thought that the general width of the sweater was not going to be as wide as it was supposed to be. So what I ended up doing was I ended up casting on about 10 additional stitches under the arm on both sides of the sweater. And what that did is it definitely allowed the sleeves to be the perfect circumference, and it allowed the body to be slightly wider. If I had not done that, I don't think it would have been as wide. And we'll get to the ease in a second. So that was the issue with my gauge here on the Clove sweater. The needle size that I ended up using, again, was the same as the recommended needle size, was the 4mm needles. I am thinking maybe I should have gone up to the 4.5mm needle in order to meet that gauge. I'm pretty sure I did swatch with a 4.5mm needle and it was too big, and I decided to just stay with the 4. But again, I don't think I like gauge swatched as well as maybe I should have, so my own faults. Intended ease versus final ease. So this, with the size large, supposed to be 50 inches, would have been 10 inches of positive ease. I ended up with 11 inches of positive ease because of these stitches that I added at the underarm. I love it. Like 10 inches versus 11 inches, again, that's kind of where we were with the Oslo sweater. It's a fine difference, and I'm really happy with the amount of ease in this sweater. And then lastly, the intended length. So this sweater has you measure from the front, right under the ribbing here. It's supposed to be 18.5 inches from top to bottom. I ended up with 18 inches, and I am totally fine with that. So not an issue there. One other kind of like change that I made was just because I was so worried about the neckband. You are supposed to knit 2 inches of ribbing here for the collar, and I only knit 1. And again, I am happy with that. So overall, happy with the Clove sweater. The Dear Duomo. So I had some personal issues with knitting the Dear Duomo. I was wanting to make a size 5, which would have been a 51-inch bust, but somewhere along the way I started reading the pattern and stitch counts for the size 4, which is a 47-inch bust. So I ended up with a sweater that was much closer to the size 4, 47 inches. You'll see it actually ended up being less than that, but that's okay. So I knit a hybrid size 4/5. For the size 5, I'm going to give you the yarn estimates of what that would have been because that's the size that I intended to make. The yarn estimates for the size 5, 3,045 yards of fingering weight. That is 7 skeins of fingering weight if in the Explorer Knits Cashmere Caverns sock base. I bought 6 skeins. I thought to myself, that's too much. I don't think I'm actually going to need 7 skeins. So I bought 6 skeins and I ended up being totally fine with that amount of yarn. I actually ended up with 109 grams of fingering weight left over, which is basically a full skein. However, I am going to go back and lengthen the sleeves on this because the sleeves are just a tad, a couple inches too short to where I like them to be. So I am glad that I have that. It's 2 balls of yarn because I was holding them together. So I am glad I have that amount of yarn left over. The recommended gauge for this is 20 stitches, and my gauge ended up being 20 stitches. I was actually on gauge. It's just such a bummer that I couldn't read the pattern and pick the right stitch counts. Whatever, it's fine. And I did also use the recommended needle size, which is a 4.5mm for the body and 3.25mm for the ribbing. The intended ease for this sweater for the size 4 is 7 inches, for the size 5 is 11 inches. I ended up with a sweater with a positive ease of 6 inches. So a little bit less than that size 4, and what I'm finding is I feel like it's a little tight, and I think there's like a couple reasons for that. The first is just because the Oslo and the Clove, like that amount of positive ease is so much bigger on these sweaters, and it's something that I'm more used to and I enjoy. So I definitely notice that this is less of a positive ease. The other thing is the ribbing on this is like really thick. This is like 2.5 to 3 inches of ribbing, and so when that hits kind of like right on my stomach area, it pulls the sweater in right there. I feel that and I notice that. Now, one thing that I also wanted to mention, kind of going back to the Clove sweater, the Clove sweater has a split hem at the bottom. Let's see if I can show you this without flashing you. This has a split hem right here. And at first I was kind of just like, yeah, I'll do the split hem, like whatever. I don't have any sweaters with a split hem, but let's like see how it goes. I absolutely love this like shaping. I feel like it brings like the front panel like forward and the back panel back, and just allows for like much more drape here. And I'm like, I haven't fully convinced myself of this yet, but I'm so tempted, and I'm almost at the point of going back and like knitting this ribbing so that it's a split hem. Anyways, so that's the intended ease. I wish I had that 10 inches of positive ease instead, but that's one of the things that I wanted to like learn about myself, is how much ease do I actually enjoy, and so I'm getting closer to knowing the answer to that. Okay, finally, the intended length of this sweater. From the front of the sweater, again, to the bottom, the intended length is 20.25 inches, and I ended up with 20.5 inches. So, very close there, and I am happy with that. This sweater is actually like a really good length to like do the like French tuck into your jeans at the front. So I do think it looks really good when I wear it like that. So, alright, let's move on. I think this is a really important piece to bring into it, and that is, what effect does the yarn choice have on the finished sweater? My conclusion to this question is that yarn choice has a huge effect on the finished sweater. And let's get into why. Fingering plus mohair. Overall, this sweater is so light, so fluffy. It's like living in a cloud, and just the weight of this feels like less weight compared to, for example, the Dear Duomo, which is 2 strands of fingering held together. Like, this sweater feels lighter than this sweater. The straight DK here, it feels light, not as like light and fluffy as a cloud, as fingering and mohair, but it does feel light, and the drape is really nice. And then 2 strands of fingering held together. This, I have thoughts. I have thoughts on this. The fabric is thicker and more dense, and the drape is not as smooth. And what I really wonder is, like I met gauge, so I used the needle size recommended, I used the gauge recommended. This is how this sweater was supposed to turn out, based on the designer's design. So like, I can't fault the design for that. But what I wonder is, should I have gone up a needle size to allow more space for these 2 strands of fingering weight yarn to like breathe and like maybe create more of a drapey piece? I don't know. I didn't like test that out because this is what the pattern called for. So, kind of something to keep in mind, not necessarily just for this pattern, but in general. I know we talk about a lot, like on Instagram, like, oh, you can hold 2 fingering weight yarns together to make a DK weight. Like, yes, you can, but just know that the fabric is going to be different, and maybe you might want to go up a needle size. You might need to do some like knitting math based on your gauge to figure out what size to make of the pattern. All of those types of thoughts and considerations I think should be taken into account if you're going to pick 2 strands of fingering weight held together to like make that DK weight. So that's my thought there. Which is the best? Again, comes down to personal preference. What I think is the best might be different than what you think is the best. But in general, the yarn choice is definitely a factor in which sweater of the 3 is my overall favorite. So let's answer that question. Which sweater is my favorite and why? If you haven't been able to guess, it's the Clove sweater, the one that I'm wearing. How could I wear either of the other sweaters to film this video when this one is like a clear standout favorite to me by far? So even though the construction and the sizing gave me a bit of a headache while actually knitting this sweater, this has ended up being my favorite drop shoulder sweater of the 3, and honestly my favorite sweater in my wardrobe right now. I have worn this sweater more times than the other two, I think, combined. In December alone, I wore this sweater 10 times. I have started keeping track of this, by the way, so this is how I have these numbers. In December, I wore this sweater 10 times. In January so far, I've worn this 6 times, plus today, so that makes it 7 times. For the Oslo sweater, I actually wore the Oslo sweater last night because it was a little chill and we were outside. But I wore this 2 times in December. Now I finished this one in October, so I have gotten more wear out of this, but I wasn't tracking my wear in October and November, so I can't give you those numbers. But in December I wore this 2 times, and in January I have worn this 2 times so far. Now, I love the fingering and the mohair weight put together. Again, fluffy cloud. But there's something about the mohair that makes me not reach for it as much. I feel like it's kind of fancy. I feel like it's almost too fluffy, and I can't wear it like all the time. Like, I feel like this is not the right sweater to wear when it's sunny outside, even if it is really cold. And really cold here for Southern California is like 40, 50 degrees Fahrenheit. I just feel like this is not the right sweater to wear. Whereas I would reach for this in that sort of weather constantly, and I have been, which is nice. But I feel like this is really only meant for like a cloudy, cozy, maybe like rainy day. Even though, like, don't get me wrong, I absolutely love this sweater. This is one of my favorites. From 2022, like one of my favorite sweaters I knit in 2022. It was in my top 3. But the Clove sweater just came out on top above that. And then the Dear Duomo, now this is the most recent one that I finished. I finished this on December 30th, so it hasn't been around as long as the others to like wear it, but I have only worn it 3 times since finishing it on December 30th. And I think one of the reasons for that is just realizing that the sleeves are a little bit too short, so I am hoping to go back soon to lengthen those sleeves, and maybe I'll end up wearing it a little bit more. But let's talk more about the Clove sweater and what I love about it so much. Like I said, yarn choice had a huge factor in why this is my favorite. The color and the variegation in general, absolutely love. I am a burgundy girly. I feel like this color really suits me well. I think the variegation on this yarn is perfectly variegated. There's no like color pooling, which I have realized recently is a huge deal for me. If a yarn you can see is like stripes, or it's got these like zigzags on it, or there's like a big splotch of one color kind of in the middle of a sweater, it like instantly puts me off to wearing that sweater. And this is like a very, very even variegation like all the way through, and I love it. It makes me happy. Additionally, like the yarn for this sweater makes this sweater warm, but not like suffocatingly warm. I can still wear this when it's like 60 degrees outside, which is great. It is perfectly classic, casual, but work appropriate. I am comfortable wearing this to the office, out to dinner, and even just like around the house, which is something that I've been trying to do more of. Again, I have found that, you know, I've knit all of these sweaters, but I haven't been wearing them. So starting to keep track of how often I am wearing the sweaters is actually like positively affecting me wanting to wear my sweaters more. However, I have found that like I'm really only reaching for these 3 sweaters plus my sweater number 15, which I also need to go back and edit because I knit one of the sleeves on that shorter than the other. And those are like my 4 like most recently knit sweaters. So I think it kind of also just relates back to like my knitting has kind of like gotten better the more that I knit, in that just like I am improving my skills and just becoming a better knitter in general, which is something that we all want, right? We're all doing it too. Okay, back to this. I love the split hem detail. I honestly think it gives such a nice look to the shape of the sweater, and again, I'm considering adding the split hem detail to more sweaters going forward. The construction did bother me a little bit, but I am willing to look past it because I'm so in love with the finished object. Hey bud, I'm in love with you too. And one last thing I feel like I have to point out, which is kind of maybe a knock to this pattern, is the designer hasn't been active on Instagram or social media from what I can tell since June of 2022, which is like slightly concerning. It just makes me wonder if like someone was knitting this pattern and needed pattern support, if she would be there to help out. So that's just one thing. And kind of my thought after like deciding that this was my favorite sweater, my thought goes back to, is it the design? Is it the yarn choice? Like, what actually is it about this that I love? And I haven't really been able to pinpoint it like more than what I just explained. It's kind of everything put together. But my thought is like, could I have used this yarn on a different pattern and gotten similar results with something that I love so much? And I don't know. Like, maybe. But I'm not sure. So that's that. That's that's my favorite. So what else have I learned through this process so far? A couple of things. I've been learning a lot, as I've kind of talked through in this video. I've been learning a lot about my own preferences, which I really think is invaluable. If this is something that you haven't thought of yet in your own knitting, I would really recommend it. I've learned that I prefer more positive ease than I thought. Up to 10 to 11 inches of positive ease is something that I'm really enjoying. This 6 inches in the Dear Duomo is really not quite enough for me to feel super comfortable. I like wearing this sweater, but not as much as I like wearing this and the Clove and the Oslo with more positive ease. I have learned that I really enjoy knitting with DK yarn and like yarn combinations where I'm using like 4mm, 4.5, 5mm needles. That really feels like my sweet spot right now, which is fun to learn about myself. And then lastly, I've learned that yarn choice is super important, and while I like variegated yarns, I really can't handle bad striping or color pooling, and it's something that I'm going to have to keep in mind when buying variegated yarns from hand dyers in the future. So when I was working on the notes for this video, I had a question box on Instagram, like asking what people wanted to know in this comparison, and one of the things that came up about 3 or 4 times was questions about the arm connection here. And some of the questions were how to do sleeves so the arm isn't crazy tight, do any of the patterns feel bulky at the underarms, and how to adjust to fit one's body type, like how to adjust the pattern to fit one's body type, for example, like larger arms. And I have a couple things about this. So first, I feel like I have maybe a larger than average bicep circumference compared to my like height and other measurements. And I honestly did not have any issues with the sleeve connection point feeling too tight or feeling too bulky at the underarms for any of these patterns. I will say, if you remember, I did add extra stitches onto the Clove sweater here, so that could be part of it, but for the Oslo and the Dear Duomo, I didn't change anything in the pattern. Maybe I am not as sensitive to like underarm bulk as other people might be, but I think these patterns are all fine. Now, If you are worried about this, here is what I would recommend. First, measure your bicep. So take one of those flexible tape measures and measure your bicep, and divide this number by 2. Look at the pattern schematic and see what the measurement is for the arm opening. Typically they will give you this measurement right here. If the arm opening is less than that half number of your bicep measurement, then you will have an issue. So for example, let's say I measure my bicep here and it's like 15 inches. If you divide that by 2, it's 7.5 inches. And I look at the schematic for this and it says 7 inches and my bicep was 7.5. I'm gonna have an issue there. The sleeve might end up being tighter with like negative ease, which maybe is not something that I want. So if that happens, here's what you can do. You will need to make the armhole larger. So if you're knitting it a top-down sweater, what you'll need to do is you'll need to knit the front and the back panels a little bit longer so that this measurement is equal to or slightly larger than your bicep measurement. If you're knitting bottom up, you will maybe want to stop the body a little bit sooner so that your front and back panels, again, can be a little bit longer. There's like also the possibility of picking up more stitches when picking up stitches for the arm. What I would caution you about that is you don't want to pick up too many stitches because you may get this like puckering effect on the sleeve that just doesn't look as good at that sleeve connection point. So I would recommend just knitting the front and back panels slightly larger, or like I did, adding more underarm stitches here, like casting on underarm stitches. The only caveat to that is that then your body will be wider, which you can combat that by doing waist shaping if that's something you're into, or just keep the wider body. But there's a little bit of math that goes into that. It's not too hard, I don't think. So it's something that you can figure out. You can do it. And send me a message on Instagram if you have questions. Alright, we are getting to the end. That's the comparison of those 3 patterns. What I also wanted to do here is provide you some additional recommendations. If you've gotten through this video and you're like, yeah, I really want to knit a drop shoulder, but maybe I don't want to knit the Oslo sweater or the Clove sweater or the Dear Duomo. Maybe I want to knit something else. Well, first, I have if you use Ravelry, I have a bundle on Ravelry called Classic Drop Shoulder Sweaters. And in this bundle are 15 patterns of classic drop shoulder sweaters. Some of these, if you'll notice, the 3 that I ended up making were all DK weight. Some of the patterns in this bundle are DK, worsted, Aran weight, maybe even up to a bulky weight. So keep that in mind if you're interested in using like a different weight of yarn. But I just wanted to quickly show you, I looked through all of these patterns in this bundle last night, and I picked out 4 that I am interested in making. And I'll just tell you a little bit about each of them. I don't want to go too into detail. You can look at all of these yourself. But I'm interested in making, the first one is the Harlow sweater by Kadri. This is a top-down, the recommended yarn is a sport plus lace weight for like a worsted weight gauge. using 4.5mm needles, so it's like a 19 stitches by 28 row gauge. So that's, you may be able to get away with like a DK weight there, maybe a light worsted. I don't know, you'll have to play around with it. But it's a top-down sweater. There are 9 sizes available from an extra small to a 5XL. So it is size inclusive. It's 8 to 10 inches of positive ease. And what I really like about this sweater is the high neck and like the long sections of 2x2 ribbing. Now if I knit this, I probably would not knit a high neck. It's not something that I wear very often, and I don't think it's super practical for Southern California. So I would just shorten that, but the sleeves and the bottom body ribbing is all like really long 2x2 ribbing, which I think is really nice. And then it's got this really cute back shoulder seam detail that I'm really interested in. So that's the Oslo Sweater by Kadri. The next one is the Marseille Sweater by Petite Knit. This is a top-down DK weight sweater. It's striped. I'm like super into stripes right now. It's like this like French inspired design. The construction is similar to the Oslo Sweater, so I know I will enjoy that. It has 9 sizes available from extra small to 5XL. And again, it's a DK weight, so it's a 21 stitches by 32 row gauge on 4mm needles. The third sweater is a recently published design, the Building Blocks Drop by Amy Scher. This is actually a bottom-up design, but before you immediately say no, let me tell you why this pattern intrigues me so much. It's a worsted weight. The recommended yarn is actually Nutidin, which is that like really like wispy woolen spun yarn. So if you don't have access to Nutidin, she does recommend some other like woolen spun, really light, fluffy worsted weight yarns. It's available in 11 sizes from A through K. It's a 38 inches to 79 inch bust, so extremely size inclusive. It's worsted weight, so the recommended gauge is 17 stitches by 24 rows on a 5mm needle. And this next part, like, honestly blew me away. If you go to the Ravelry page, or I'm assuming her website as well for this pattern, there is a link to a free 6-page document that is available even before you purchase the pattern. It walks you through sizing, needle size, gauge, yarn selection, the construction method, special techniques. It includes a number chart for schematics for every size in the pattern, and it also includes like photo schematics and different fit modifications for this pattern. For example, there is a long sleeve option, there's like a short sleeve vest option, there is a regular hem option, there's a split hem option, there's a split high-low hem option where it's higher in the front and lower in the back. There's an option for a pocket on the sweater, on the front of the sweater, or you can do it without the pocket. There are so many different options and so many modifications available, and I love that like all of this information is available for you for free to view before you even purchase the pattern, so you can decide if this is a pattern for you or not. I think that's amazing. And honestly, all patterns should have this information available before purchase, because how many times have you like started to buy a pattern and then you realize something about it that isn't what you wanted? Okay, last but not least, a pattern that I would like to make and would recommend is the Lakes pullover by Ozetta, which like honestly, just every time I hear the name puts me in a Taylor Swift folklore the lakes vibe. Take me to the lakes where all the poets. This is a top-down worsted weight pattern. that is offered in 9 sizes. It has an 18 stitches by 28 row gauge on 5mm needle. And I really like the shoulder details on this pattern. And I think it's the yarn that the sample is knit in, but it just like looks like a sweatshirt and like a super cozy sweater. So that's why this is on my list. Like I mentioned, there are 15 patterns in that bundle if you want to go check it out. There are a bunch of others that I did not include in this short list. A lot of them were like worsted Aran to like light bulky weight sweaters, which getting up into the Aran and bulky weight sweater territory is not where I'm comfortable. I would prefer to stay in the DK weight zone, maybe these light worsted sweaters that I just talked about, but that's where we're at. So we did it. That's the end of my comparison. If you have any other questions that I didn't answer in this video, please leave them in the comments down below and I will answer them. If you enjoyed this video, please take a moment to subscribe to my channel. I have a goal of reaching 1,000 subscribers and we are so close. We are almost there. Subscribing just really helps my channel out. It helps it helps tell YouTube that people are enjoying my videos, and then it will recommend my videos to more people. And it's just a free and easy way to help a creator out. So Buddy came to agree. Alright, the dogs really want to go get out of here. I've been keeping them all cooped up. Thank you for hanging out with me, and I hope you have a great rest of your day and can get some knitting in. Alright, I'll talk to you later. Bye!